Boston Harbor, 2:13 a.m., inside an abandoned waterfront warehouse. Any last words? Marcus Thorne whispered, pressing the gun against Claire's forehead. Claire's wounded lip trembled, but her tear-filled eyes remained fiercely defiant. Yes, she breathed. Julian Vance will kill you. Thorne threw back his head and laughed. Julian Vance is dead. Suddenly, boom. The steel doors exploded inward. Smoke swallowed the warehouse as a blood-covered man stepped through the flames. Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. Julian. The supposedly dead mafia boss raised his weapon. Take your hands off my family. But Thorne lifted a red detonator and smiled. Then you can all die together. How did Julian return from the dead, and could he save Claire before the entire building collapsed? Stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and let the story begin. Julian Vance didn't flinch. Not when he crushed a rival Boston syndicate. Not when he dismantled a billion-dollar tech firm just to prove a point to a greedy CEO. He was a man made of ice and tailored Italian wool. But right now, he couldn't breathe. He sat behind his massive oak desk. His dark eyes were locked on the glass wall of his office. Beyond that glass sat Claire Sterling, his executive assistant, his obsession. She was typing furiously. Her blonde hair was pinned up, but one stray curl brushed her neck. Julian stared at the tiny, frantic flutter of her pulse right at her collarbone. It mesmerized him. Julian ran a city that didn't know it was being run. He controlled politicians. He controlled the ports. He controlled everything. Because if you control the world can't abandon you. That was the bitter lesson he learned as a bruised, unwanted kid bouncing between violent foster homes. Control meant survival. You never trust anyone. You never let anyone close enough to hold a knife to your back. But he didn't control Claire. She was entirely her own person. She had showed up in his lobby 3 years ago. A runaway from Washington, D.C. She had nothing but a cheap suitcase and a spine made of steel. He later found out who she had run from. Richard Sterling. A corrupt senator who viewed human beings as currency. A man who had tried to force his own daughter into a strategic, political marriage to fund his campaign. Julian remembered the day he found out. He had offered to have her father handled. A single phone call and Richard Sterling would never bother her again. Claire had looked him dead in the eye. She hadn't blinked. No, she had said. My life is mine, Julian. I decide who gets to be a part of it, and I decide how I defend it. Women are not property to be bartered away. Nobody buys me, nobody trades me. Not him and not you. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. She demanded absolute bodily autonomy. She demanded respect, and Julian, a man who took whatever he wanted, actually gave it to her. He watched her fiercely defend those same rights for others. Just yesterday, he had overheard her berating a sleazy vendor who had harassed a junior secretary in the lobby. A woman doesn't owe you a smile. She doesn't owe you a conversation. And she certainly doesn't owe you her space. Claire had snapped over the phone, her voice cold and steady, her body, her rules. You cross that line again, and I'll make sure you never work in this city. She was a fierce protector. Julian respected that. He craved it. 2 months ago, that professional distance had shattered. It was a late Tuesday night. A storm was raging outside, flooding the Boston streets. They were exhausted, celebrating a massive, bloodless acquisition. One glass of whiskey turned into 2. The space between them vanished. Julian still remembered the heat of her skin, the way she pulled him in. For one night, the ice in his veins melted. For one night, he wasn't a ruthless mob boss. And she wasn't an employee. They were just 2 people, desperate for something real. The next morning, Claire had rebuilt the wall. It was a mistake, she had said. Her voice was shaking slightly as she gathered her clothes from his floor. I can't belong to you, Julian. I won't be another asset in your portfolio. True strength isn't forcing someone to stay. It's giving them the freedom to walk away. He had let her walk out. He wanted to give her the choice. But the truth was eating him alive. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't focus. He just wanted her. Julian opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He reached inside and pulled out a small, velvet box. He flipped it open. Inside sat a heavy iron key. It belonged to a private estate in Vermont. A place with no security cameras. No armed guards, no blood on the floorboards. A safe house. He was going to give it to her. He was going to draft a new contract. Not an employment contract. An arrangement. A permanent one. He wanted to offer her an equal partnership. He wanted to prove that he didn't want to own her. He just wanted to be chosen by her. He snapped the box shut, through the glass. He saw Claire stand up. She looked pale, sickly even. Her hand rested on her stomach for a brief second before she grabbed her phone. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes darting nervously around the empty floor, before she hurried toward the break room. Julian frowned. She had been sick lately, calling in late, skipping her afternoon coffees, looking exhausted. His chest tightened. Was she ill? Was Richard Sterling threatening her again? Julian stood up. He smoothed his suit jacket. He grabbed the velvet box and slipped it into his pocket. He would go to her right now. He would give her the key. He would tell her that she was safe, that she had a choice, and he prayed to whatever God was listening that she would choose him. He walked out of his office. The thick carpet absorbed his footsteps. The penthouse floor was quiet, bathed in the gray light of a rainy afternoon. He pushed the heavy wooden door to the break room open just an inch. The lights inside were dim. Julian opened his mouth to call her name. Then he heard it. Claire was pacing near the sink. Her back was to the door. She had her phone pressed tightly to her ear. She was shaking. "No," Claire whispered. Her voice was frantic, desperate. "No, you have to cancel the appointment." Julian froze. His hand stalled on the brass door handle. "I don't care about the deposit." Claire pleaded into the phone. She wrapped her free hand protectively around her waist. "Just cancel it. He can't know." Julian's heart slammed against his ribs. Who couldn't know? "Please." Claire's voice cracked. A tear slipped down her cheek, catching the dim light of the room. "Don't tell him about the baby." The velvet box in Julian's pocket suddenly felt like a heavy block of lead. "If Julian finds out," Claire sobbed quietly, leaning her forehead against the cool tile of the backsplash, "he'll destroy everything." The world stopped spinning. The air was sucked from the room. Julian Vance didn't breathe. He didn't blink. The pulse that usually beat with a calm, calculated rhythm was instantly replaced by a deafening roar in his ears. The baby, if Julian finds out, he'll destroy everything. His mind violently fragmented. The trauma of his childhood, the deep-seated terror of betrayal, clawed its way up his throat like a wild animal. She was hiding a child. She was terrified of him. Or worse, she was conspiring with someone else. Maybe another man, maybe an enemy. The ironclad control that made him a king shattered into a million jagged pieces. He looked at the woman he loved, the woman he wanted to give his entire world to. And in that terrifying, frozen second, Julian Vance didn't see a future. He only saw a traitor. He took a slow step back into the shadows. He let the heavy door click shut. The velvet box burned in his pocket. The ice returned to his veins, thicker, colder, deadlier than ever before. It was over. Julian didn't confront her. Not then. He walked back to his office. He locked the heavy oak door. He sat in the dark. He didn't scream. He didn't break the glass. He just let the cold wash over him. It was a familiar cold, the exact same chill he felt at 7 years old. The day his mother promised she would return, only to drive away forever. Trust is a liability. He had forgotten that rule. Claire had made him forget. Julian picked up his phone. He dialed a secure line. His voice was perfectly level. "Dead boss." Donovan answered on the first ring. Donovan was his head of intelligence. A man Julian had pulled from the gutters of Southie. A man he trusted. That was his first mistake. "I need a full sweep on Claire Sterling," Julian said. "Emails, calls, medical record, bank transfers, everything from the last 60 days. Put it on my desk by midnight." Claire Donovan sounded surprised. "Is there a problem? Just do it." Julian hung up. He didn't leave the office. He sat there as the sun set over Boston. The city lights flickered on below him. Millions of people. Millions of lies. He waited. At midnight, the door clicked open. Donovan walked in. He carried a thick manila folder. His face was grim. "You're not going to like this, Julian." Julian didn't move. "Put it on the desk." Donovan set the folder down. He took a step back. "She's pregnant. About 8 weeks. But that's not the worst part." Julian's jaw tightened. "Go on." "I tracked the clinic. I pulled the billing records. The deposit for her prenatal care was paid in cash, but the emergency contact listed on the file." The Donovan paused. "Is since Marcus Thorne." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus Thorne, the only man in Boston who actively wanted Julian dead. A sadistic weapons dealer who had been trying to dismantle Julian's empire for years. "Show me," Julian whispered. He opened the file. There it was. Forged, but Julian didn't know that. It looked flawless. Clinic letterheads, bank transfer receipts. A string of encrypted text messages between Claire S. number and a burner phone traced to Thorne S. inner circle. The texts were damning. He doesn't know. Keep it that way. When the baby is born, we take the ports. Julian stared at the ink. It blurred. She was carrying Thorne's child. She had slept with Julian 2 months ago. Yes, but she had been with Thorne too. She was using the baby, using him. She was a spy, a weapon aimed directly at his throat. The woman who demanded bodily autonomy. The woman who preached about respect and rights. It was all a performance. Something inside Julian snapped. It wasn't a loud break, it was a quiet, fatal fracture. The man who wanted to give her the world died in that chair. The ruthless mob boss woke up. What do you want me to do? Donovan asked. Freeze her accounts, Julian said. His voice sounded like grinding stone. Cancel her apartment lease. I own the building, evict her. Tonight, and the girl. She's not a girl. She's a hostile threat. Julian stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. I'll handle her myself the next morning. Boston was drowning in rain. The corporate lobby of Vance Holdings was packed. Hundreds of employees milled about. Security guards flanked the marble pillars. Claire walked through the revolving doors. She shook the rain from her umbrella. She looked tired, her skin was pale, but she walked with that same straight spine. She swiped her security badge at the turnstile. A red light flashed. Access denied, she frowned. Access denied. Problem with the system, she asked the nearest guard. The guard didn't look at her. He just stepped aside. Julian stepped out from the shadows of the elevator bank. He wore a charcoal suit. His eyes were completely vacant. The lobby grew quiet. People noticed. The CEO never came down to the lobby. Claire looked up. Her eyes met his, a soft, relieved smile touched her lips. Julian, my badge isn't working. Julian walked toward her. His footsteps echoed on the marble. He stopped inches from her. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He reached out. His hand brushed her collarbone, the same spot he had stared at yesterday. Then his fingers closed around the lanyard of her security badge. He yanked it. The fabric snapped. The plastic badge cracked in his fist. Claire gasped. She stumbled forward. Julian, what are you doing? You're fired. His voice carried. It bounced off the marble walls. Everyone heard it. Claire froze. Her eyes went wide. Confusion gave way to pure panic. What? Why? What happened? You know what happened, Julian leaned in. He lowered his voice, but the venom in it was absolute. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I was stupid? Claire, her breath hitched. The blood drained from her face. The baby. He knew about the baby. Julian, please. Her voice broke. She reached for his arm. I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. Don't touch me. He stepped back. He looked at her hand like it was diseased. Your accounts are frozen. Your apartment is gone. You have nothing. You can't do this. Tears welled in her eyes. Julian, it's yours. It's yours. Julian let out a harsh, cruel laugh. Do you think I don't know about Thorne? Claire stopped. Her tear-streaked face contorted in total confusion. Thorne, Marcus Thorne, I don't even know him. Julian, what are you talking about? Stop lying, Julian didn't yell. He hissed, and somehow that was infinitely more terrifying. You're a traitor. You're a liability, and worst of all, you're a terrible liar. He threw the broken badge at her feet. Get out of my building. Get out of my city. If I see your face again, I won't see this polite. He turned his back on her. He walked away. He didn't look back, not even when she started sobbing. Not even when security grabbed her arms and shoved her out into the freezing rain. Outside, the storm raged. Claire hit the wet pavement. Her knees scraped against the concrete. The cold soaked through her coat instantly. She looked up at the towering glass building. The place she had helped build. The man she had stupidly, desperately loved. He had crushed her. Without a second thought. Without asking for the truth. He had stripped her of her livelihood, her home, and her dignity. She touched her stomach. She was completely alone. And she was terrified 4 days later. The motel room smelled like bleach and cheap tobacco. The wallpaper was peeling. The heater rattled, but it blew cold air. Claire sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress. She was shivering. She had $20 to her name. Her credit cards declined. Her bank told her the accounts were locked pending a federal investigation. A lie Julian had orchestrated. She was incredibly nauseous. She leaned over a plastic trash can. She retched. Nothing came up. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She wiped her mouth with a trembling hand. She needed a plan. She needed to survive. She couldn't crumble. Not now. She had a life inside her. A life she had to protect. My body, she whispered to the empty room. My choice. We will survive this. She stood up. Her legs wobbled. She grabbed her coat. She needed to find a pawn shop. She had a watch she could sell. It would buy food. Maybe a bus ticket out of Massachusetts. Someone knocked on the door, 3 heavy, rhythmic thuds. Claire froze, her heart hammered in her throat. Housekeeping, a gruff voice called out. Claire didn't move. Housekeeping didn't knock like that. She backed away from the door. She reached for the heavy brass lamp on the nightstand. The lock clicked, the door swung open. A tall man stepped into the room. He wore a flawless navy suit. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His smile was razor-thin. Richard Sterling, her father. Claire dropped the lamp. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. "Hello, Claire," Richard said. He looked around the dismal room. His nose wrinkled in disgust. "Look at how you live. Like an animal. I told you independence was a fantasy." 2 massive bodyguards stepped into the room behind him. They blocked the door. Claire backed up until she hit the wall. "How did you find me? You lost your protection." Richard took a step forward. "That thug you were working for. Vance, he threw you to the wolves. He made a very public spectacle of it." Word travels fast. Claire swallowed hard. Julian hadn't just fired her. He had broadcast her vulnerability to her enemies. "What do you want, Richard?" she demanded. Her voice shook, but she forced her chin up. "I want my daughter back," he smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "My poll numbers are dropping. The family image is fractured, but a wedding, a beautiful, traditional wedding to Senator Hayes' eldest son, that will secure the funding I need. I'm not marrying Arthur Hayes." Claire spat. "I don't love him. I barely know him." "Love is for the poor, Claire." Richard stepped closer. "You owe this family. You will do your duty. I don't owe you anything." Claire shouted. She needed to assert her humanity. "I am a human being. I am not a bargaining chip. I am not a piece of property you can trade for campaign donations. My life belongs to me." Richard backhanded her. The strike was fast, brutal. Claire hit the floor, her lips split. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. "You belong to me," Richard hissed. "You have always belonged to me. Your autonomy is an illusion. You are a woman in a world run by men with power. You have no rights here." Claire looked up at him. Her cheek burned, but the fire in her eyes was brighter. "You can drag me back," she whispered. "But I will stand at the altar and tell the world exactly what you are. An abuser." Richard sighed. He adjusted his cuffs. "Take her." He told the guards. "Sedate her if you have to. Throw her in the van." The 2 men lunged. Claire fought. She kicked. She scratched. She managed to slip past the first man. She bolted for the open door. She burst out into the freezing night air. "Grab her." Richard roared from inside the room. Claire ran. She ran toward the dark alley beside the motel. Her lungs burned. Her stomach cramped sharply. She slipped on the wet asphalt. She fell hard. Footsteps pounded behind her. One of the guards grabbed her by the hair. He yanked her backward. Claire screamed. She thrashed wildly. "Hold still, you crazy bitch." The guard grunted. He pulled a syringe from his pocket. Claire squeezed her eyes shut. This was it. She had lost. Her baby, her freedom, her life. Suddenly, a blinding light flooded the alleyway. Tires screeched. An engine roared like a mechanical beast. Claire opened her eyes. A massive, armored black SUV tore down the narrow alley. It didn't slow down. It aimed straight for the guards. The guard holding Claire dropped her. He dove out of the way just as the 2-ton vehicle smashed into a dumpster, crushing it against the brick wall. The SUV doors flew open. 4 men in tactical gear poured out. They were armed with suppressed rifles. They didn't shout. They didn't hesitate. They moved with lethal, military precision. They slammed Richard's guards against the brick wall. They disarmed them in seconds. Claire lay on the wet asphalt. She was shaking uncontrollably. A pair of polished black leather shoes stepped into her field of vision. She looked up. Julian Vance stood over her. He looked like a god of war. His suit was immaculate. His face was a mask of cold fury. He looked down at her. He saw her split lip. He saw the dirt on her coat. Claire sobbed. The relief was overwhelming. It washed over her like a warm tide. He had come. He had realized his mistake. He had saved her. He loved her. Julian crouched down. He reached out. Claire leaned into his touch. She expected him to pull her into a hug. She expected a desperate apology. Instead, Julian's hand clamped around her upper arm. His grip was entirely devoid of warmth. It was bruising. He hauled her roughly to her feet. "Get in the car," he ordered. His voice was dead. Claire stumbled. "Thank God." "My father," he was trying to, I said. "Get in the car." He didn't look at her with love. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated contempt. The illusion of safety shattered. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just changing locations. The ride was silent. Claire sat in the back of the SUV. The leather was soft. The heater was running, but she had never felt colder. Julian sat across from her. He stared out the tinted window. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't ask about her bleeding lip. The silence was suffocating. "Where are we going?" Claire finally whispered. Julian didn't look at her. "Home. I don't have a home. You took it. My home." Claire's heart skipped a beat. A desperate, foolish spark of hope flared in her chest. "Are we going to talk about this?" "Julian, the things you said in the lobby. You were wrong. I can explain everything." Julian turned his head, his dark eyes locked onto hers. The absolute absence of empathy in his stare made her recoil. "There is nothing to explain," Julian said flatly. "Donovan found the clinic records. I saw the bank transfers. I saw the text messages." "What text messages?" Claire begged. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop." Julian held up a hand. The command was absolute. "Do not insult my intelligence." "Not again. You played a brilliant game. Claire, I'll give you that. You almost had me. I wasn't playing a game. You're carrying Thorne's child." The words hit her like a physical blow. Claire stopped breathing. She stared at him. The sheer absurdity of the accusation paralyzed her. "Thorne," she choked out. "Marcus Thorne. Julian, I have never even met him." "The baby is yours. It happened that night in your office." "You know it did." Julian's jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. He leaned forward. His presence overwhelmed the small space. "Do not ever try to put that bastard's blood on my hands," he hissed. "I know the truth. You thought you could use the kid to secure the ports. You thought I would be too blinded by you to see the knife. Julian, you're paranoid. Someone is lying to you. The only liar in this car is you." He leaned back. He buttoned his jacket. He dismissed her entirely. The SUV pulled through a massive set of wrought iron gates. They drove up a winding, tree-lined driveway. They stopped in front of a sprawling, heavily fortified stone mansion. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Security cameras tracked their every move. The doors opened. Julian stepped out. He didn't offer her a hand. Claire scrambled out after him. The rain had stopped, but the wind was biting. "Why bring me here?" Claire asked. Her voice trembled. "If he hated her this much, why save her?" "Because Richard Sterling is a liability," Julian said smoothly, walking up the grand stone steps. "If he forces you into a political marriage, he gains leverage. I don't like my enemies having leverage." He opened the massive mahogany front doors. He stepped inside. Claire hesitated on the threshold. "Enter," Julian commanded. Claire stepped into the foyer. It was breathtakingly beautiful. Marble floors, a sweeping staircase, crystal chandeliers. It was a palace. And a prison. Julian turned to face her. "You will stay in the East Wing," he stated. It was a decree, not a conversation. "You will not leave the grounds. You will not have a phone. You will not have internet access. You will be monitored 24 hours a day." Claire stared at him in horror. "You're kidnapping me. I am containing a threat. I am a human being," Claire shouted. The tears spilled over, hot and angry. "You can't do this. I have rights. You can't just lock me away because your paranoia tells you to." "Rights," Julian scoffed. He stepped closer. He looked down at her. "Out there. You have rights. Out there. Your father was going to drug you and sell you to the highest bidder. In here, you only have what I allow you to have." He pointed a finger at her chest. "You used your body as a weapon against me. So now your body belongs to this house." The cruelty of the statement was designed to break her. It struck at the very core of what Claire believed in: bodily autonomy, freedom. He was stripping it all away. He was reducing her to an object, a vessel. "What happens when the baby is born?" Claire whispered. She dreaded the answer. Julian looked at her stomach. A flicker of something dark and painful flashed in his eyes, but he buried it instantly. "When Thorne's bastard is born," Julian said coldly, "I will hand the child over to child services. I will strip Thorne of his leverage. And then, I will put you on a plane to a country where you can never, ever return to Boston." Claire's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the marble floor. He was going to take her baby, her child, his child. "No," she sobbed. She wrapped her arms around her stomach. "Julian, please, you can't. It's yours, it's yours." Julian didn't look down at her. He couldn't. If he looked at her broken form, he might shatter, show her to her room. Julian ordered the silent guard standing by the door. He turned and walked up the sweeping staircase. He left her weeping on the floor. The guards stepped forward. They gently but firmly pulled Claire to her feet. They led her down a long, quiet hallway. They opened a door. The room was stunning, a massive four-poster bed, a roaring fireplace, a tray of hot food waiting on a silver platter, a gilded cage. They pushed her inside. The heavy door closed. The lock clicked. A dead final sound. Claire ran to the door. She pounded her fists against the thick wood. "Julian," she screamed. Her voice tore at her throat. "Julian, please, don't do this." No one answered. She backed away from the door. She looked around the beautiful, silent room. The reality of her situation crushed her. She had escaped one abusive monster, only to be locked away by another. A monster she had foolishly loved. She sank to the floor in front of the roaring fire. She pulled her knees to her chest. She rocked back and forth. She had nothing, no name, no money, no freedom. But as the fire warmed her shivering skin, a tiny resilient spark flared deep inside her chest. Julian Vance thought he had broken her. He thought he had contained her. He was wrong. She was a mother now. She would fight. She would find the truth. And she would tear this gilded cage apart with her bare hands if she had to. She would not be his prisoner. The food went cold on the silver tray. Again, it was the fourth day. Claire sat by the massive window of the east wing. She stared out at the barren winter trees. She didn't cry anymore. The tears were gone. Only a hollow, aching silence remained. She wore a simple cotton dress. She refused the silk gowns Julian had sent to the room. She refused the books. She refused the lavish meals prepared by his private chef. She was fading, deliberately. A cage of gold was still a cage. If she ate his food, she accepted his terms. If she wore his clothes, she accepted his ownership. She would not be owned. Her body belonged to her. Her mind belonged to her, even trapped behind reinforced steel and biometric locks. Her autonomy was the one thing he could not physically take. She would rather starve than surrender it. 3 Julian sat in the dark. The security control room hummed with the sound of cooling fans. A wall of monitors glowed with blue light. Every angle of the estate, every hallway, a dozen angles of her room. Julian stared at the center screen. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie was discarded. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled. He watched her sit by the window. She hadn't moved in 4 hours. She looked so fragile, like a ghost haunting his house. "She has to eat." Boss Donovan stood in the doorway. He held a cup of black coffee. He didn't step fully into the room. The air around Julian was too volatile. "Too, I know," Julian rasped. His throat felt like sandpaper. "The doctor said the stress alone could cause a miscarriage," Donovan said quietly. "If she doesn't take fluid soon, her organs will start shutting down." Julian closed his eyes. The words felt like physical blows. He was doing this. He was killing her. He thought he was containing a threat. He thought he was being ruthless. The survivor. The king who never let anyone hold a knife to his back. But looking at the monitors, he didn't feel like a king. He felt like his mother. He felt like the abusive foster fathers he had sworn to destroy. He had become the exact monster he hated. He was using his power to crush a woman who had nowhere else to go. "Boss," Donovan pressed. "She went to the bathroom. 10 minutes ago, she hasn't come out." Julian's eyes snapped open. He looked at the monitor. The bathroom door was closed. There were no cameras inside. He had drawn the line there. A shred of privacy, Claire. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. He didn't wait. He didn't speak. He bolted from the chair. Julian sprinted out of the control room. He took the stairs 3 at a time. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. The deafening roar of absolute terror filled his ears. He reached the east wing. He swiped his hand over the biometric scanner. The heavy door unlocked. Julian burst into the room. "It was empty, Claire," he shouted. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He grabbed the brass handle of the bathroom door. It was locked from the inside. Claire opened the door. Silence. Then, a sound that made his blood freeze. The sharp, violent crash of shattering glass. Julian didn't hesitate. He stepped back. He raised his leg. He kicked the solid wood door with bone-shattering force. The wood splintered. The frame cracked. He kicked it again. The door flew open. Julian froze. The massive vanity mirror was shattered. Jagged shards of glass covered the marble floor. Claire lay in the center of the wreckage. She was unconscious. Her skin was the color of ash. A line of blood trickled down her palm where a piece of glass had cut her as she fell. "No," Julian choked out. The ruthless mob boss died completely in that moment. He dropped to his knees. He didn't care about the glass cutting into his expensive trousers. He didn't care about the blood. He scooped her fragile body into his arms. She was freezing. She weighed nothing. "Donovan," Julian roared at the top of his lungs. "Get the medical team now." He pressed his face against her cold forehead. He held her tight against his chest. "Don't leave me," he begged. The words tore from his throat, raw, desperate. "Please, God, Claire, don't leave me." The next few hours were a blur of absolute agony. Julian didn't leave the underground medical wing. He paced the sterile white hallway. He watched the private doctors hook her up to IV fluids. He watched them monitor the baby's heartbeat. The steady, rhythmic thump of the fetal monitor echoed in the room. Thump, thump, thump. It was strong, defiant, just like its mother. When Claire finally opened her eyes, the room was bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. She blinked. Her mouth was dry. She felt the tug of the IV in her hand. She turned her head. Julian was sitting in a chair beside the bed. He looked destroyed. His hands were clasped in front of his face. His knuckles were white, tears actual. Silent tears tracked down his face. Claire stared at him. She had never seen him cry. "Julian," she whispered. His head snapped up. He let out a ragged breath. He moved to the edge of the bed. He reached for her hand, but he stopped himself. He pulled his hand back, like he didn't deserve to touch her. "You're awake," he said. His voice was completely broken. "What happened? You collapsed." "Dehydration," he swallowed hard. "The baby is fine. You're going to be fine." Claire looked at the ceiling. The reality of her cage rushed back. "Why do you care? You're just going to take it away anyway." Julian squeezed his eyes shut. A look of pure self-loathing crossed his face. "I'm not going to take your child." "Claire," I was out of my mind. I was completely consumed by my own terror. He stood up. He walked to the foot of the bed. "I brought the clinic files," Julian said softly. He pointed to a manila folder resting on the table. "I had my cyber team dig deeper, beyond the surface layer, beyond the initial encryption." Claire looked at the folder. She didn't speak. "They were forged," Julian said. The admission sounded like ash in his mouth. The bank transfers, the emergency contact, the text messages, all of it. A phantom trail created by a ghost server in Eastern Europe. Claire slowly pushed herself up against the pillows. "Marcus Thorne," she said. Her voice was weak, but the anger was there, yes. Julian looked at the floor. "He planted a mole in my intelligence division. When I asked Donovan to sweep your records, the mole intercepted the request. He fed me a manufactured reality." Claire stared at the man she loved. "And you believed it," she whispered. The words hit harder than bullets. Julian flinched. "I did. You didn't ask me. You didn't talk to me." Claire's voice gained strength. The fire returned to her eyes. "You just assumed I was a monster. You assumed I would use a child as a weapon. I assumed everyone was a monster. Claire. Because that is the only world I have ever known." Julian stepped closer. He didn't hide his shame. "When I was 7, my mother told me she was going to the store to buy milk. She kissed my forehead, she smiled, and she never came back. I bounced from home to home. Every time I trusted someone, they hit me. They starved me, they sold me out." He looked deep into her eyes. "I built an empire on the absolute certainty that people will always betray you. If you give them the power to hurt you, they will use it. I am not them." Claire said firmly, "I am not your mother. I am not your abusers, I know that now." Julian dropped to his knees beside the bed. The King of Boston knelt on the cold tile floor. "That day in the break room," Julian whispered, "I was coming to give you the key to a safe house. I wanted to offer you a life with me, free of control. But I heard you on the phone. You were crying," you said. "Don't tell him about the baby. If Julian finds out, he'll destroy everything." Claire gasped. The memory of that phone call flooded back. "I was talking to my doctor," Claire said. Her voice broke. "Why?" Julian pleaded. "Why were you hiding it from me? If the child is mine, why were you so terrified?" "Because of what you told me." Claire cried out. The pain of the last 3 days finally exploded. 6 months ago, after we closed the shipping deal, we were drinking. You told me you hated children. You said bringing a child into your world was child abuse. You said attachments were a death sentence." Julian stared at her. The memory hit him. "I was pregnant," Claire sobbed. "I was terrified. I thought if I told you, you would force me to get an abortion. I thought you would see the baby as a liability and erase it. Erase me." Julian's breath caught in his throat. The horror of what he had done. The horror of what he had made her believe. "Claire," he reached out, this time. He didn't pull back. He gently took her bruised hand in both of his. "I am so sorry." The words were not enough, he knew that. "I used my trauma as an excuse to inflict trauma on you." His voice was steady now. "Absolute. I violated your rights. I treated you like property. I became the very thing I despise." He pressed his lips to her knuckles. "You do not belong to me. You belong to yourself. Your body is yours. Your child is yours." Julian looked up at her. His eyes were burning with a desperate, terrifying hope. "I am dismantling the syndicate. Starting tomorrow, the illegal ports, the extortion, all of it. I am burning it to the ground." Claire stared at him in shock. "Julian, they'll kill you." The other families let them try. His voice was cold iron again, but this time it was aimed at the world. Not her. I am done dealing in blood. I am done operating in the shadows. I am going to build something legitimate, something worthy of you. He stood up. You are free. Claire, the doors are unlocked. Your accounts are restored. When you are strong enough to walk, you can walk right out the front door. I will give you a security detail. I will give you anything you want. He stepped back toward the door. I will spend the rest of my life trying to prove that I am a man you can trust. But the choice to stay, that is entirely yours. Julian turned to leave. He gave her the one thing he had stolen, her autonomy. Julian. He stopped at the door. He didn't turn around. Don't go far, Claire whispered. Julian closed his eyes. A ragged breath escaped his lips. He stayed. A week passed. The ice didn't just break. It melted completely. Julian kept his word. Every single one of them. The heavy security doors in the east wing were propped open. The guards were instructed to take orders directly from Claire. But the biggest change was Julian himself. He sold the illegal shipping routes. He liquidated the offshore accounts. He systematically tore apart the dark empire he had spent 15 years building. He did it ruthlessly. He poured the money into a legitimate venture capital firm. He began drafting plans for a massive philanthropic foundation, a network of safe houses for women and children escaping abuse. He was putting his money where her heart was. They sat together in the massive library. The fire roared in the hearth. Claire was reading a book on nonprofit management. Julian was reviewing legal contracts for the new foundation. You're giving up a lot of power, Claire said quietly. Julian didn't look up from his papers. His pen scratched across the thick parchment. Power isn't making people fear you, Julian replied. His tone was casual, but the words carried immense weight. I thought it was. I thought fear was respect. But fear just breeds resentment. It breeds moles. It breeds betrayal. He signed his name at the bottom of a contract. He closed the folder. Julian looked across the room at her. His eyes softened. True power is creating an environment so safe. The people you love voluntarily choose to stay. I don't want an empire of prisoners, Claire. I want. Smiled. It was the first real genuine smile she had given him in weeks. It made Julian's chest ache. Are you ready for tonight? He asked. Tonight was the Boston Children's Charity Gala. It was the premier social event of the season. It was also Julian's coming out party. He was going to stand on a stage in front of the mayor, the governor, and every wealthy elite in the state. He was going to announce the launch of his foundation. He was going to publicly step out of the shadows and into the light. And he was going to do it with Claire by his side. I'm nervous, Claire admitted. My father will be there. He always attends these things. Julian's jaw tightened slightly. Richard Sterling will not come within 50 feet of you. I have men positioned at every exit. If he even looks at you wrong, he will be escorted out. He stood up. He crossed the room. He offered her his hand. You are safe with me. Claire, I swear it on my life. Claire looked at his hand, the strong, calloused fingers. She placed her hand in his. I know. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of crystal, silk and gold. Thousands of candles flickered in massive chandeliers. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets carried silver trays of champagne. The elite of Boston laughed and mingled. Julian and Claire stood near the edge of the dance floor. They were breathtaking. Julian wore a bespoke black tuxedo. He looked like a lethal weapon wrapped in velvet. Claire wore a flowing emerald green silk gown. It draped perfectly over her small, barely noticeable baby bump. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders. She looked like a queen, and Julian treated her like one. You're staring, Claire whispered. She took a sip of sparkling water. Julian agreed. He didn't look away. I can't help it. Across the room, Richard Sterling stood near the bar. He held a glass of scotch. His eyes were locked on Claire. He looked furious. His political campaign was bleeding money. And his runaway daughter was standing with the one man in Boston Richard couldn't bully. But Richard wasn't alone. Standing in the shadows of the arched doorway, nursing a drink, was Marcus Thorne. Julian didn't see him. Thorne was a master of staying out of sight. The orchestra at the front of the room began to play. The soft, hauntingly beautiful notes of Claire de Lune drifted over the crowd. Julian set his glass down. He turned to Claire. Dance with me. She set her water down. You dance. Only with you. He led her to the center of the polished wooden floor. The crowd parted for them. They moved with a quiet, undeniable authority. Julian placed one hand on her waist. He took her other hand in his. They began to move to the music. It was perfect, the lights, the music, the warmth of his hand. Claire rested her head against his chest. She closed her eyes. She listened to the strong, steady beat of his heart. She was safe. The nightmare was over. The gilded cage was gone, replaced by a man who respected her, a man who was changing the world for her. They swayed in the center of the room. Time seemed to stop, crack. It wasn't a loud noise. It sounded like a heavy branch snapping in the winter wind. But Julian Vance knew that sound. The suppressed cough of a high-caliber sniper rifle. Time didn't stop. It shattered. Julian's instincts, honed by a lifetime of violence, overrode his conscious thought. He didn't look for the shooter. He didn't draw a weapon. He looked at Claire. He grabbed her shoulders and violently threw his body in front of hers. He spun them around, placing his back to the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows. Thwack, the sound of a bullet hitting flesh. Julian jerked violently. A sickening grunt escaped his lips. Thwack, a second impact higher. Near his shoulder blade, the massive crystal window behind them exploded into a million pieces. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the ballroom like a bomb. The music stopped abruptly. The crowd screamed, absolute. Chaotic panic erupted. Hundreds of people scrambled for the exits. Women tripped over their gowns. Men shoved each other out of the way. Julian didn't make a sound. His weight collapsed onto Claire. Julian, Claire shrieked. They fell to the polished wooden floor together. Julian hit the ground hard. Claire scrambled to her knees beside him. The emerald green silk of her dress was instantly soaked. Blood, so much blood, it poured from Julian's chest. It pooled on the immaculate dance floor, a terrifying crimson lake. Julian's eyes were wide. They stared at the painted ceiling. He was gasping for air. A horrifying, wet, gurgling sound came from his throat. No, 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 Claire screamed. She pressed her hands against the massive wound on his chest. Hot blood seeped through her fingers. Help. Julian's hand twitched. He weakly reached up. His blood-soaked fingers brushed her cheek. Claire, he choked. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. Stay with me, Claire sobbed. Julian, look at me, stay with me. His eyes lost their focus. The fierce, terrifying light in Julian Vance's eyes flickered. And then it went out. His hand fell limply to the floor. His chest stopped moving. Julian, Claire wailed. She collapsed over his chest. She wept with a sound that tore at the very fabric of the room. It was the sound of a soul breaking. Suddenly, rough hands grabbed her shoulders. Get off him. Claire was violently yanked backward. She looked up through her tears. Marcus Thorne stood over her. Two massive, armed mercenaries flanked him. Thorne smiled. It was a cold, reptilian expression, such a tragedy. Thorne sneered. He looked down at Julian's lifeless body. The king is dead. You killed him. Claire whispered. The horror paralyzed her. He went soft. Soft men don't survive in this city. Thorne grabbed Claire's arm and hauled her to her feet. Let me go, Claire screamed. She thrashed. She fought like a wild animal. But she was exhausted. She was pregnant. And the men were massive. Richard Sterling stepped out from the panicked crowd. He walked calmly through the chaos. He didn't look at Julian's body. He looked at his daughter, Claire. Richard said smoothly, You belong to me. Thorne's men dragged Claire backward. She reached out toward Julian. Her bloody hands grasped at the empty air. Julian, her screams echoed in the grand ballroom. But Julian didn't move. The mercenaries dragged her out the side door. They threw her into the back of a waiting van. The doors slammed shut, plunging Claire into total darkness. The world had ended. The news hit the networks before midnight. Julian Vance was dead. The assassination at the Plaza Hotel triggered a massive domino effect. Without their ruthless king, the Vance syndicate collapsed into absolute chaos. The mole inside Julian's intelligence network triggered a total system failure. The encrypted servers were wiped. The offshore accounts were drained. Within 2 hours, the FBI launched a massive, coordinated raid on Vance Holdings. Federal agents kicked down the doors of the corporate headquarters. They seized the assets. They arrested the lieutenants who hadn't already fled the city. An empire built over 15 years burned to ash in a single night. Marcus Thorne sat in a leather chair. He watched the news on a small television. He smiled. He took a sip of expensive whiskey. He was sitting in an abandoned manufacturing warehouse on the edge of the Boston Harbor. The wind howled outside, rattling the corrugated metal walls. In the center of the vast, empty room, Claire was tied to a wooden chair. Her hands were bound behind her back with thick zip ties. Her emerald dress was ruined, stained with Julian's blood. Her face was pale, but her chin was up. She was not crying. The tears had dried. The shock had faded. What remained was a cold, terrifying fury. She was a mother. She was alone, and she was going to survive. Richard Sterling stood a few feet away. He paced nervously. This wasn't the deal, Thorne, Richard said. He pointed a finger at the television. You were supposed to scare Vance off. You assassinated him in public. The feds are swarming the city. Thorne chuckled. He set his glass down. Scare him, Thorne laughed. You don't scare Julian Vance, Richard. You put him in the ground. Now I control the ports. I control the supply lines. I am the king of this city. I don't care about your ports. Richard snapped. I want my daughter. Give her to me. We're leaving for D.C. tonight. Thorne looked at Claire. His eyes traced her figure. I don't think so, Thorne said softly. Richard stopped pacing. Excuse me. She's Vance's woman. Thorne stood up. He walked slowly toward Claire. She knows where the backup servers are. She knows the account passwords. She was his shadow. I'm going to keep her until she talks. We had an agreement, Richard yelled. Claire watched them. Her mind raced. Julian had taught her how to read a room. He had taught her how to spot the cracks in an alliance. Thorne was arrogant. Richard was desperate. He's using you, Richard, Claire said. Her voice was calm, steady. It echoed in the large warehouse. Both men looked at her. Shut up. Claire, Richard hissed. He doesn't care about your campaign. Claire continued. She kept her eyes locked on her father. He used your political connections to get his sniper past the hotel security. You provided the access. Now that Julian is dead, you're a liability. He's not going to let you walk out of here. Thorne raised an eyebrow. He looked at Richard. She's a smart girl, Thorne noted. Vance taught her well. He's going to kill you. Dad, Claire used the word intentionally. A psychological trigger. He's going to bury you in the harbor. And he's going to keep me. Richard swallowed hard. He looked at Thorne. Thorne's mercenaries subtly shifted their stances. Their hands rested near the grips of their weapons. Doubt is a poison. And Claire had just injected a massive dose into the room. You're paranoid, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. Men who need to tie women to chairs are weak, Claire said. Her voice rang out with absolute clarity. They operate on fear because they lack genuine authority. Thorne is a coward. A coward always eliminates loose ends. Thorne's smile vanished. He stepped forward. He raised his hand. He slapped Claire across the face. Hard, her head snapped to the side. Her ear rang, but she didn't look down. She slowly turned her head back. She stared Thorne dead in the eye. You hit like a coward too, she spat. Thorne pulled a heavy black pistol from his waistband. He pressed the barrel against Claire's forehead. Let's test that theory, Thorne whispered. 20 miles away, the city morgue was quiet. The stainless steel tables were lined up in neat rows. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. On table number 4, a body lay under a white sheet. The coroner, an older man with thick glasses, walked over to the table. He carried a clipboard. He pulled the white sheet back. He expected to see the face of a dead mob boss. Instead, a massive blood-stained hand shot up. The hand grabbed the coroner by the throat. The coroner dropped the clipboard. He choked, his eyes bulging in absolute terror. Julian Vance sat up on the metal table. His chest was wrapped in thick, bloody bandages. His skin was pale. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with every agonizing breath. But his eyes were open. They were completely, terrifyingly alive. The Kevlar vest he had worn under his tuxedo had stopped the bullets from piercing his heart. The impact had broken 4 ribs. The kinetic shock had stopped his heart for exactly 40 seconds, long enough for the paramedics to call it. Long enough for the mole to trigger the collapse. Julian released the coroner's throat. The man collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Julian slowly swung his legs over the side of the metal table. Every movement was agony. It felt like hot knives twisting in his chest. He didn't care. He stood up. His bare feet hit the cold tile floor. His empire was gone. His money was seized. His men were arrested. He had nothing left except the woman he loved and the child she carried. Julian walked to the evidence locker at the end of the room. He grabbed a heavy metal stool. He smashed the glass door. He ignored the alarms blaring in the hallway. He pulled out his bloody tuxedo pants. He put them on. He reached into the back of the locker and pulled out the confiscated weapons from the night's arrests. He loaded a tactical shotgun. He shoved 2 heavy pistols into his waistband. He wasn't a CO anymore. He wasn't a mob boss. He was a father, and he was going to burn the world to the ground to get his family back. Julian racked the shotgun. The heavy metallic clack echoed in the morgue. He walked out the double doors. He didn't need an army. He was the army. The cold steel of the pistol pressed against Claire's forehead. Marcus Thorne smiled. His finger tightened on the trigger. Any last words? Thorne whispered. Claire did not close her eyes. She stared right through him. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. Then, the world exploded. A massive blast tore through the front of the warehouse. The heavy corrugated metal doors ripped off their hinges. They flew through the air like crumpled paper. Thorne stumbled backward. The pistol fired, the bullet striking the concrete ceiling. Thick gray smoke poured into the cavernous room. The mercenaries raised their rifles. They aimed blindly into the dust. Footsteps echoed in the smoke, heavy, measured, terrifying. A shadow stepped through the wreckage. Julian Vance. He was supposed to be dead. He looked like he had clawed his way out of hell. His tuxedo pants were stained with his own blood. His bare chest was wrapped in thick red bandages. He held a tactical shotgun in his hands. His eyes were completely hollow. They locked onto Thorne Vance. Thorne screamed, his voice cracked with sheer panic. Kill him now." Julian didn't hesitate. He raised the shotgun. He pulled the trigger. The deafening blast shook the foundation. One mercenary dropped. Julian pumped the action. A second man fell. It was not a gunfight, it was an execution. Julian moved with terrifying, mechanical precision. He ignored the bullets snapping past his head. He ignored the agonizing pain tearing through his broken ribs. He only saw Claire. Thorne scrambled backward. He ducked behind a massive steel shipping container. He pulled a small detonator from his pocket. "You want to die together." Thorne screamed over the gunfire. "Fine by me." Thorne pressed the red button. The support columns of the warehouse detonated. The blast wave knocked Julian to his knees. A deafening roar filled the room. The ceiling groaned. Massive steel girders buckled. Fire erupted along the walls. The old chemicals stored in the warehouse caught instantly. A wall of orange flames roared toward the ceiling. The building was collapsing. Julian pushed himself off the floor. His vision blurred, blood soaked through his bandages. He sprinted through the flames. He reached Claire. She was coughing, choking on the thick, toxic smoke. Julian dropped the shotgun. He pulled a combat knife from his waistband. He slashed the thick plastic ties binding her wrists. Julian gasped. She fell forward. Julian caught her. He pulled her tightly against his bleeding chest. "I've got you," Julian rasped. His voice was raw. "I'm right here. I've got you." A heavy steel beam crashed to the floor behind them. Sparks showered the air. "We have to move," Julian shouted. He pulled her to her feet. He wrapped one arm around her waist. They stumbled toward the loading docks. The fire was spreading incredibly fast. The heat was blistering. Suddenly, a figure lunged from the smoke. Richard Sterling. Her father looked completely deranged. His expensive suit was scorched. His face was covered in soot. He held Thorne's dropped pistol in his shaking hands. He aimed the gun directly at Julian's head. "You ruined everything," Richard screamed. "My campaign, my life. You took my property." Julian didn't flinch. He let go of Claire. He stepped in front of her, shielding her body with his own. He reached to his waistband. He drew his heavy pistol in a lightning-fast motion. Julian aimed right at the center of Richard's chest. His finger rested heavily on the trigger. This man had abused Claire. He had tried to sell her. He had allied with the men who put bullets in Julian's chest. Julian wanted to kill him. He wanted to watch him die. Julian, no. Claire grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Julian kept his eyes on Richard. "He deserves to die, Claire." "He's a monster, I know," Claire shouted over the roaring flames. "But you are not. Look at me." "Julian, look at me." Julian forced his eyes away from Richard. He looked at the woman he loved. Her face was covered in ash. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Your blood isn't worth staining the hands that will hold my child," Claire pleaded. Her voice rang with absolute conviction. "We do not deal in blood anymore. We believe in justice, not murder. If you pull that trigger, you let him turn you back into a killer." She placed her hand over his weapon. "Let the law have him," she whispered. "Choose us. Choose a better world." Julian stared at her, the fierce, desperate love in her eyes broke through the dark, violent rage in his mind. True strength was not taking a life. True strength was having the power to kill and choosing to walk away. Julian lowered the gun. He looked at Richard with absolute disgust. "You are nothing," Julian stated. "You have no power over her. She is a free woman, and she pities you." Julian turned his back on the armed man. It was the ultimate insult. He wrapped his arm around Claire again. They hurried toward the shattered loading doors. Behind them, the roof began to cave in. Flaming debris rained down. Richard screamed as a burning beam blocked his exit, trapping him in the inferno. Julian and Claire burst through the doors. They collapsed onto the wet grass outside. The cold night air hit their lungs. They were out. They had survived. Julian dropped his pistol. He pulled Claire into a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her hair. "You're safe," Julian murmured. Its sirens wailed in the distance. The police were coming. Claire clung to his shoulders. She was trembling violently. Suddenly she gasped. It was a sharp, agonizing intake of air. Her fingers dug into Julian's bloody bandages. "Claire," Julian pulled back. Panic surged in his chest. "Are you hit?" Claire shook her head. Her face contorted in pure agony. She looked down. A pool of clear fluid soaked into the dark grass beneath her. "My water," Claire choked out. A sob ripped from her throat. "My water broke," Julian froze. "It's too early," Claire cried. She gripped her stomach. "It's only 28 weeks. Julian, it's too early." A massive contraction hit her. Claire screamed, doubling over in pain. The shock, the smoke inhalation, the sheer terror of the night. Her body was failing. Julian scooped her into his arms. The pain in his broken ribs blinded him, but he ignored it. He ran toward a stolen car parked near the fence line. The nightmare wasn't over. The hardest battle had just begun. Julian drove like a madman. He blew through every red light. He swerved past cars. The tires screamed against the wet asphalt. Claire writhed in the passenger seat. She gripped the dashboard. Every contraction tore a fresh scream from her lips. "Breathe," Julian pleaded. His voice shook. "Just breathe, Claire. We are almost there." He couldn't take her to a regular hospital. The police were hunting him. The feds were tearing his empire apart. If they walked into a public emergency room, he would be arrested. Claire would be left alone. He drove to the only place he had left. An underground surgical clinic operating out of an abandoned warehouse district. The doctor who ran it owed Julian his life. Julian slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt in front of a rusted metal door. He jumped out. He pulled Claire from the car. She was barely conscious. Julian kicked the metal door open. "Doc," Julian roared. His voice echoed down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway. "Doc, get out here." A middle-aged in green scrubs rushed out of a back room. "Dr. Evans." He took one look at the blood-soaked man and the pregnant woman in his arms. "Bring her in," Dr. Evans ordered. Julian carried Claire into a bright, sterile operating room. He laid her gently on the surgical table. "Julian," Claire whispered. Her eyes were rolling back. She was losing too much blood. "The baby. Save the baby. I'm going to save both of you," Julian promised fiercely. He kissed her forehead. Dr. Evans pushed Julian backward. "You need to wait outside. You're covered in contaminants." "Get out." Two nurses rushed in. They started hooking Claire up to monitors. Julian stumbled backward into the hallway. The heavy metal doors swung shut, locking him out. He stood alone in the quiet corridor. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in her blood. The ruthless mob boss, the king of Boston. He had controlled politicians. He had moved millions of dollars with a single phone call. Now he was completely powerless. He slid down the white cinderblock wall. He hit the cold floor. He pulled his knees to his chest. Julian Vance began to pray. He didn't know who he was praying to, but he begged. He offered his life, his soul, every dollar he had ever made. Just let her live. Time lost all meaning. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been 10 hours. The metal doors finally clicked open. Dr. Evans walked out. His surgical gown was covered in blood. He pulled his mask down. His face was grim. Julian scrambled to his feet. His heart hammered wildly in his chest. "Doc," Julian choked out. "How is she?" Dr. Evans didn't smile. He looked Julian dead in the eye. "Her body is failing, Julian." The doctor's voice was heavy. "Apologetic, the placental abruption is severe. She is hemorrhaging faster than we can transfuse her." Julian stopped breathing. "The baby is in distress," Dr. Evans continued. "The heart rate is dropping rapidly." "Fix it," Julian demanded, his voice cracked. "Do whatever you have to do." "Fix it, I can't." Dr. Evans stepped forward. He placed a hand on Julian's bloody shoulder. "Julian, you need to listen to me. I only have time to save one of them." The words echoed in the silent hallway. "What?" Julian whispered. "If I focus on stopping the mother's bleeding, the baby will not survive the stress. If I perform an emergency C-section to extract the child right now, Claire will bleed out on this table." The doctor squeezed Julian's shoulder. "You have to choose, right now, the mother or the child." In the Mafia, an heir was everything. A child was legacy, a child was the future. Women were considered replaceable. Julian Vance fell to his knees. The physical pain in his chest was nothing compared to the absolute agony shredding his soul. He thought about the tiny heartbeat he had heard on the monitor, the life they had created, the future they had dreamed of in the gilded cage. He thought about Claire. Her fierce independence, her beautiful, defiant eyes, the way she had looked at him in the fire and told him to be a better man. He couldn't live in a world without her light. Julian looked up at the doctor. Tears streamed down his soot-stained face. Save her, Julian wept. His voice broke into 1,000 pieces. Kill me, take my heart, but save her. Dr. Evans nodded slowly. He turned and rushed back through the metal doors. Julian collapsed onto the floor. He curled into a ball. He sobbed. Uncontrollable, agonizing sobs that shook his entire shattered body. He had made the choice. He had sacrificed his child to save the woman he loved. The silence in the hallway was deafening. It stretched on for an eternity. Julian waited for the flatline. He waited for the end of his world. Suddenly, a sound pierced the heavy metal doors. It was faint, weak, but it was there. A tiny, sharp cry. He lifted his head. The cry grew louder. It was angry. The doors swung open. A nurse stood in the doorway. She was crying. She held a tiny bundle wrapped in a heated blanket. "Mr. Vance," the nurse whispered. "It's a miracle." Julian scrambled to his feet. He staggered toward the door. He looked at the tiny, red-faced infant. She was so small, so impossibly fragile. "She fought," the nurse sobbed happily. "She just fought her way out." The doctor managed to stop the bleeding just in time. They both made it. Julian reached out with trembling hands. He gently touched the baby's tiny cheek. "Claire," he choked out, "she's weak. But she's stable. She's asking for you." Julian walked into the operating room. Claire looked exhausted. Her skin was pale, but her eyes were open. Julian walked to the side of the table. He fell to his knees beside her head. He pressed his face against her cheek. "You're alive," Julian wept. "You're both alive." Claire turned her head weakly. She kissed his tear-stained cheek. "I told you," she whispered. "We are going to survive." Julian closed his eyes. The mob boss was dead. The empire was gone, but as he held the woman he loved, Julian Vance knew he was finally a king. 1 year later, the autumn leaves in Vermont were spectacular. Bright gold, fiery orange, and deep crimson painted the rolling hills. The air was crisp and clean. It smelled like pine and wood smoke. Julian stood on the wide wraparound porch of his sprawling, sunlit estate. He wore a simple gray sweater and faded jeans. The expensive Italian suits were gone. The cold, empty stare was gone. He looked healthy. He looked at peace. He held a small, squirming bundle against his chest. Grace, she was a tiny terror. 1 year old, with her mother's bright blonde curls and her father's intense, calculating dark eyes. She grabbed a fistful of Julian's sweater and babbled happily. Julian smiled. He kissed the top of her head. A black sedan pulled up the long gravel driveway. Julian watched calmly. There were no armed guards on the perimeter anymore. There were no sniper rifles hidden in the trees. The security was discreet, designed to protect, not to imprison. The car door opened. Donovan stepped out. He looked out of place in the quiet country setting. He still wore a sharp suit. He still carried the heavy weight of the city on his shoulders. Donovan walked up the porch steps. He looked at Julian. He looked at the baby. "You looked different, boss," Donovan said softly. "I'm not your boss anymore." "Donovan," Julian shifted Grace to his other arm. Donovan nodded. The feds finally closed the case. Richard Sterling was sentenced to 20 years for conspiracy and corruption. Marcus Thorne took a plea deal. He'll die in a federal penitentiary. Julian felt a profound sense of relief. The ghosts of Boston were finally buried. The old families are fighting for your territory. Donovan continued. The ports are a mess. The streets are bleeding. With one phone call, Julian, you could take it all back. They're weak. You could rule the entire East Coast. Julian looked out at the rolling hills. "I already rule everything that matters," Julian said. He looked at Donovan. It was the lesson that had saved his soul. "Power isn't putting a gun to someone's head and forcing them to kneel. I thought it was, but that's just fear. And fear is fragile," Julian smiled. "Real power is building a place so safe. The people you love voluntarily choose never to leave." Donovan stared at him. He understood. The ruthless king was truly gone. "Take care of yourself, Julian. You too, Donovan." Donovan walked back to his car. He drove away, disappearing down the long, quiet road. The wooden screen door behind Julian creaked open. Claire stepped onto the porch. She wore a soft, oversized cardigan. Her blonde hair was tied back in a messy knot. She carried 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She walked over to Julian. She handed him a mug and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Was that Donovan?" Claire asked. "Yeah." Julian took a sip of the coffee. He brought good news. It's really over. Claire let out a long, contented sigh. She reached over and tickled Grace's chin. The baby giggled loudly. I just got off the phone with the foundation directors, Claire said. Her eyes sparkled with passion. The new safe house in Chicago is fully funded. We are opening the doors next month. 50 beds for women escaping domestic violence. Complete legal support, job placement. Julian looked at her with absolute adoration. She had built an empire, not one of blood and extortion, but one of healing and hope. You did that, Julian said proudly. We did that, Claire corrected him gently. You provided the initial capital. You gave up everything for it. It was the best investment I ever made. Claire turned to face him. She set her coffee mug on the wooden railing. I am giving a speech at the opening, Claire said softly. I want to talk about human rights. I want to talk about bodily autonomy. I want every woman walking through those doors to know that they are not property. They are not collateral. They own their bodies. And they own their futures. She looked deep into Julian's eyes. And I want to tell them that true strength is found in compassion, not control. Julian swallowed hard. The emotion tightened his throat. They need to hear that, Julian whispered. I needed to hear that, Claire smiled. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pulling him close. Grace babbled happily between them, perfectly safe in the space her parents had carved out of the darkness. Julian rested his chin on the top of Claire's head. He looked out over the sunlit estate. The world was vast and beautiful. I used to think holding on tight was how you kept things, Julian murmured into the crisp autumn air. I thought if I locked the doors, no one could ever abandon me. Claire tilted her head up. She brushed her lips against his jaw, and now she asked. Julian looked down at the woman who had shattered his cage and saved his soul. Now, Julian smiled. I know that love is opening your hands, and watching them choose you anyway. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a desperate kiss born of fear or control. It was a kiss built on equality, respect, and a fierce, undeniable partnership. They stood together on the porch. A family forged in fire, a testament to the enduring power of choice. The shadows were gone. The dawn of their new empire was remarkably bright. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event. And so, Julian Vance lost the empire he had spent his entire life building, but in losing it, he finally discovered what was truly worth protecting. For years, Julian believed power meant control. He believed that if he owned the buildings, controlled the money, watched every door, and frightened every enemy, then no one could ever hurt or abandon him again. But fear did not make him safe. It only made him lonely. The walls he built to keep betrayal out also trapped him inside with his own wounds. And when Claire's pregnancy awakened his deepest fear, Julian did what wounded people sometimes do. He allowed the pain of his past to become a weapon against someone who had never harmed him. He judged her without listening. He punished her without seeking the truth. He stripped away her home, her security, and her freedom because he was more willing to believe his trauma than the woman he claimed to love. That is one of the most important lessons this story leaves us with. Suffering may explain a person's behavior, but it does not excuse cruelty. Pain can help us understand why someone builds walls, but it can never justify locking another human being behind them. Claire's strength was not found in physical power, wealth, or influence. She had none of those things when Julian cast her into the rain. Her strength came from knowing that her dignity still belonged to her, even when everything else had been taken away. She understood that a woman is not a property, not her father's political bargaining chip, not a rival's source of leverage, and not a powerful man's possession. Her body, her choices, and her future belonged to her. Even inside the beautiful prison Julian created, Claire refused to surrender the most important part of herself. She reminded us that a golden cage is still a cage, and protection without consent is simply another form of control. Love cannot exist where one person holds all the keys and the other must beg to be free. Real love does not say, "You belong to me." Real love says, "You belong to yourself, and I am grateful that you choose to stand beside me." Julian's redemption did not begin when he said he was sorry. Words alone could never erase what he had done. His redemption began when he accepted responsibility without demanding immediate forgiveness. He unlocked the doors. He restored Claire's freedom. He dismantled the criminal empire that had taught him to treat people as assets and threats. He used his wealth to create safe houses for women and families escaping abuse. Most importantly, he gave Claire the right to walk away, even though losing her was the thing he feared most. That is what true repentance looks like. It is not asking the person you hurt to comfort you. It is not explaining your behavior until they feel guilty for being angry. It is changing the conditions that allowed the harm to happen. It is surrendering power, accepting consequences, and becoming better whether forgiveness comes or not. The story also reminds us that trust cannot survive without communication. Claire hid the pregnancy because she feared Julien's reaction, while Julien filled the silence with the darkest possibilities his mind could create. Neither of them spoke honestly before fear took control. Their silence created an empty space, and manipulation entered that space. Marcus Thorne did not destroy them with superior strength. He nearly destroyed them by feeding Julien the lie Julien was already prepared to believe. This is why healthy love requires more than passion. It requires difficult conversations. It requires patience when fear tells us to attack. It requires the courage to ask, "What is the truth?" instead of deciding that our worst suspicion must be real. Trust does not mean ignoring danger. It means giving the person we love the chance to speak before we pronounce them guilty.